Thank you very much. And I want to thank Teresa and Kathy and Nancy for helping make this possible today. It's a great honor. Interestingly for me, in looking at the picture of the bridge, the connection with that bridge goes right across the street from where I grew up on 46 Parker Avenue in Poughkeepsie. So that railroad was operating when I was a kid, and I remember many times looking at that train and throwing rocks at it and everything. So it has a special place in my heart. It's an honor to be with you. The Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project has been around since about 2008, maybe 2007. We're a grassroots group of local historians, interested folks, some educational people, who have done research and interpretation of the issues around the history of slavery, anti-slavery, and the Underground Railroad in the Mid-Hudson region. We have concentrated primarily on Dutchess County and a little bit on Ulster County. There's a lot more work to be done in this area. And let me give a shout out to Dan Jones and his wife Anita. Dan has been with the Underground Railroad, with the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery Project for a long time. He's a wonderful comrade to work with, and I'm so glad he's listening, as with everybody else. Can we have the next slide? And let's skip over that one to the next one, Teresa. So I'm taking a little bit of a different approach today. From the early 1400s in through the 1800s, the entire Atlantic Ocean area was a danger zone for Africans and their descendants. The period was marked by invasion, kidnapping, sexual subjugation, and death. Risk was everywhere, not only on the seas. America's colonies and eventually states proved unsafe as well. For Blacks, this entire geographic expanse constituted what historians describe as spaces of danger, within which mishap and tragedy might strike at any time. Even freedom through the Underground Railroad or by other means did not protect Blacks from danger. Across time and space, everywhere was unsafe. Next. One of those who lived her entire life within, around, or running away from this danger was Isabella Baumfree, known later in her life as Sojourner Truth. It's important that we recognize her today because I know we're getting close to commemorating and installing a new statue for Sojourner. She was a great advocate, obviously, for Black and women's rights. So I'm starting by honoring this local hero, and we're going to return to her later on. Next. Finding the truth about the Underground Railroad has often been difficult. A lot of the history was kept secret. The story is often filled with myths and romance. How do we assess the relative roles of whites and Blacks in leadership? Why is it so difficult to find evidence? Because of this, historian Carol Kamen wrote about no other local topic except perhaps the weather. Are there more legends, more hearsay, or more dubious claims? About no other topic is there more to question. The Underground Railroad story involves three parts: people, paths, and problems. There were two groups of people involved in the quest for freedom. First, the freedom seekers themselves, those enslaved men and women who ran away from their enslavers. And then second, the anti-slavery advocates in the North who were willing to flout the law and help fugitives on their way to freedom. And there wasn't, of course, just one way out of enslavement. In general, though, almost all paths or routes led north to Canada. There were some enslaved people in the South who actually went further south, for instance, into the Florida area. The problems in trying to understand the railroad are myriad and present steep challenges to historians. Where can we find evidence? How and when did it get its name? When did it start? Who ran it? How many freedom seekers did it help? What was its impact in antebellum America? What does it mean to us today? We're going to touch on some of this and share some ideas for further research and hopefully come away with a better understanding of the Underground Railroad right here in our own backyard. Next. So let's begin with three major figures related to our local Underground Railroad history. Frederick Douglass, from an early age, was looking to get out from under his yoke of forced service. And after one unsuccessful attempt, he finally made it north to New York City in 1838. To get there, he needed to ride on 2 trains, a ship, and 2 ferries, finding his way with the fortuitous help of a handful of free blacks and sympathetic whites. Alone, when he arrived, he was directed to the home of this man, David Ruggles. Next. Ruggles, a free black, was secretary and prime mover of the New York Committee of Vigilance, whose purpose was to maintain a watch over both the enslaved and free communities of blacks in New York City. At his own initiative, Ruggles began to provide assistance to runaways and became one of the best known operators of the Underground Railroad in New York. He provided some immediate assistance to Douglass, then urged him to move on to New England, where he might more easily merge into the black communities in the shipping towns along the coast. In the 1850s, by then a national figure, Douglass delivered 2 anti-slavery addresses in Poughkeepsie. In addition to Douglass, Ruggles helped hundreds of other fugitives, including this man, Samuel Ringgold Ward. Like Douglass, Ward escaped from slavery along the Maryland shore and came first to New York City, where he met with Ruggles. The two formed an anti-slavery bond, and after Ward moved to Poughkeepsie, Ruggles began sending fugitives up to him on their way heading further north. I start with these 3 people because they provide us a powerful link between the national story of the Underground Railroad to our story here in the Valley. They also allow us to examine several of the most important themes that played out in the movement of the freedom seekers. By the time of Douglass's successful attempt to freedom, the term Underground Railroad had been in use for a decade or more. Some in both the South and the North would describe missing slaves as, quote, being on the Underground Railroad, close quote, meaning that their whereabouts were a mystery. The term grew in usage in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism and took on its nationwide significance after passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Second, Douglass and Ward ran away of their own volition. They were self-emancipating. In the case of Douglass, he was helped by various people he met on his journey. His journey reflected the common experience of enslaved people starting their journey to freedom by themselves. Now, the running away of enslaved people predates the operation of the Underground Railroad, and we'll touch on that more in a minute. And lastly, Douglass and Ward followed one of the 2 major pathways to freedom for enslaved people in the Upper South, from the upper eastern slave states into Pennsylvania, on to New York City, then to points north. Some skirted New York City and went up through New Jersey and south central New York. Now, the other route on the other side was out of Kentucky, up into Ohio, Detroit, and into Canada. Next. The Hudson Valley was one of the main arteries of the Underground Railroad. Freedom seekers made their way here before moving further north to Albany, across central New York, or northeast into Massachusetts and Vermont. The available evidence of Underground Railroad activity is sparser than we'd like. It was meant to be kept secret, certainly so from outsiders. But here we're dealing with hints, a small newspaper clipping here and there, some letters, a memoir written years after the fact. And there was the occasional bold public statement, such as from the Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society, calling on all good people to help runaways gain their freedom. Despite this lack of enough evidence, it's a very exciting story. Next. In Dutchess County, there were two Underground Railroad paths. The first was known as the Quaker Trail to Freedom. Eastern Dutchess County had the largest Quaker settlement outside Philadelphia, which from the last decades of the 1700s had been strongly anti-slavery. The trail included the oblong, 9 Partners, and Oswego meetings. These were part of a necklace of Quaker meetings that extended from New York City up to Vermont. Many runaways began their journey north from the Quaker meeting in Brooklyn, went up then to the meeting in Purchase, then to Eastern Dutchess County. Families and meetings were intertwined. For instance, it was common for people to move between 9 Partners, Oswego, and the Milton meeting in Marlborough and Ulster County. From the Quaker Trail, people could then move on to Massachusetts or Vermont. Quakers could travel from New York to Burlington without ever sleeping in a non-Quaker house. So could freedom seekers. Next. Shown here is the oblong meeting near Pauling. One of the most prominent oblong leaders was David Irish, a preacher and avid protester against slavery. According to testimony given by his daughter Phoebe at the end of the 1800s, the Irish family house was always open to welcome runaways. These freedom seekers were fed and lodged, then given directions to the next stop. In a letter to the Friends newsletter written in 1858, Irish gives us an example of his and other Quakers' passion on this issue. Quote, "He who can contemplate the wrongs done to the slave and the iniquities of the masters with feelings of indifference may justly suspect himself as wanting not only in regard for the good of his fellow men, but in one important characteristic of a disciple of Christ. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Next. The 9 Partners area at Millbrook was settled around 1750, and the Quakers organized the meeting there in 1769. Its attendant school, pictured here, is no longer standing. It was the ancestor to today's Oakwood Friends School in Poughkeepsie. This school was the most significant abolitionist institution in the eastern part of the Hudson Valley. Some of its well-known students included next James and Lucretia Coffin Mott. Lucretia chaired the Seneca Falls Convention on Women's Rights while maintaining her support for abolition and Black rights. Another student was Daniel Anthony, abolitionist and father of Susan B. Anthony. Roland Robinson and Rachel Gilpin, who lived on the Underground Railroad site in Vermont, met here as students. The last of the 3 outposts on the Quaker Trail to Freedom was the Oswego Friends meeting at Moore's Mill in central Dutchess County. Built in 1760, Oswego, like 9 Partners, was an offshoot of the oblong meeting. The house no longer survives. It was the home of Stephen Haight and Alfred and Charlotte Haight Moore. According to oral history, we don't have any written records on this, all 3 engaged in Underground Railroad activity. Now there's an apparent direct link between Oswego and the town of Milton. The daughter of a friend at 9 Partners reported that freedom seekers were sometimes taken from 9 Partners and Moore's Mill to the home of Valentine Halleck, located just south of Poughkeepsie on the road that led to the Milton Horse Ferry. Next, yeah, shown here. Yep. Halleck grew up in Marlborough, and he and his family were prominent members of the Friends meeting at Milton. So fugitive slaves may have been taken across the river on the Milton Ferry, where they could be sheltered by Quakers of the Milton meeting. Or they might have made the reverse trip after having come up on the west side of the Hudson River. We might include this ferry connection with the second route of Underground Railroad travel, what we call the River Trail to Freedom. Freedom seekers came up along the Hudson on both sides, by boat or wagon or walking. We've already seen how David Ruggles sent Runaways up to meet Ringgold Ward in Poughkeepsie. On the west side, there's some evidence that Port Jervis on the Delaware River was a jump-off place for other runaways. They likely crossed the valley and went to Newburgh before traveling to points north. This route seems to have been an alternate direction coming out of Philadelphia. The list here identifies several sites in the Hudson Valley which have been confirmed as Underground Railroad stations. There are other locations where there was possible activities but have not been fully confirmed. In continuing north, one of the first stops would have been in Hudson in Columbia County. In the mid-19th century, 2/3 of the families there were Quakers. A key figure was Charles Marriott, who was in contact with David Irish, the New York City abolitionists, and Roland Robinson in Vermont. He was also one of the few Underground Railroad people who left documentary proof of what they were doing. In a letter sent to Roland Robinson in 1838, he wrote that, quote, "Many fugitives from the South effect their escape. 3 passed through my hands this week." This small book by Roger King, The Silent Rebellion, is a collection of old newspaper stories and some memoirs chronicling the movement of freedom seekers through the Orange County area. In speaking recently with the Orange County historian, it seems that no one has yet attempted to flesh these out. This is important work to be done and may yield us a lot more good information on the Underground Railroad activity. Now, the next big wave of organized anti-slavery activity in this region came in the 1830s. The creation of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Boston in 1833 marked the rise of a new radical anti-slavery presence in the United States. Unlike earlier groups, the American Society called for the immediate emancipation of slaves. This attitude undoubtedly made it easier for abolitionists to justify helping freedom seekers on their journey. In the Hudson Valley, Dutchess County was known as an outpost of radical anti-slavery activity, with the people of Dutchess engaged in overt organizing and political action. In 1834, just 1 year after the formation of the national organization, local abolitionists created the Poughkeepsie Anti-Slavery Society. Soon to follow were anti-slavery societies in several towns throughout the county: LaGrange, Fishkill, Pleasant Valley, and elsewhere. Both men and women were involved in these organizations, and both signed various petitions to Congress calling for the end of slavery. In 1838, a countywide organization was formed calling for the immediate abolition of slavery. And at their 1840 convention, members passed a strongly worded anti-slavery resolution that ended with this: resolved, that we collectively and severally will do all in our power to assist those brethren coming through this county who may have thus far escaped the iron grasp of tyranny, by giving them meat, money, and clothes to enable them to prosecute their journey to a land of liberty. That was a powerful public stance taken on behalf of enslaved fugitives. Even though the words Underground Railroad are not used, the implication of the language is that local citizens would unite in organized support for the Runaways. They carried this message to other regional and national anti-slavery gatherings. The frequently religious tone of language found in the anti-slavery petitions is a reflection of communities of faith in the area. Churches often took the lead in the work of, quote, moral influence, close quote. The newly founded African Methodist Episcopal churches in Fishkill and Poughkeepsie, as well as the First Congregational Church, were involved. Reverend Philetus Roberts, a Black minister of the First Christian Church in Stanford, served as president of the Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society. Now, in addition to Black clergy, there were several free Black communities in the area. In Baxtertown, near Fishkill, Freemanville, out near Poling, the Guinea community in Hyde Park, and a fugitive Black community in Hurley in Ulster County. All of these were said to be safe harbors for freedom seekers. So here we see for ourselves the merging of white men and women, Black churches and Quaker communities, free Black men and women, the cross-fertilization of anti-slavery societies, all calling for the abolition of slavery and providing assistance to runaways. They engaged in a united front against oppression, marked by speeches, sermons, mass gatherings, petitions, and songs. I think we can safely agree with Underground Railroad historian Fergus Bordewich in identifying the Underground Railroad effort as, quote, America's first civil rights movement, close quote. I do want to mention on Nancy's behalf that part of this mass movement was driven by anti-slavery, abolitionist, and Underground Railroad themed songs. There were at least 700 songs written during the 30-year period immediately prior to the start of the Civil War, with dozens involving the inclusion of actual runaway events or references to other freedom seekers and moving to Canada, etc. Now we get into a little bit more understanding the problems. One reason for the dearth of Underground Railroad evidence undoubtedly was the intensity of the opposition to anti-slavery in our area. Spreading the word was not easy. While the Hudson Valley may have been a center for anti-slavery work, it was also rife with opposition. Most places on the Hudson River, lamented Samuel Ringgold Ward, were, quote, thoroughly and hopelessly pro-slavery. Ward, who by this time had become a preeminent lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society, was prevented from speaking pretty much anywhere in the Hudson region. Many churches and public buildings were closed to him and to others. At one point, the wheels were stolen from his wagon. Earlier on, local slaveholders in the town of Shwangung in Ulster County organized the Society for the Apprehension of Slaves. The society maintained a list of slaves belonging to the families who became society members, and when any such family felt the slave was acting in a way that suggested he or she meant to run away, they notified the president of the society. 8 members were designated as, quote, writers to apprehend and return the runaway. In 1837, a mob of anti-slavery opponents in Poughkeepsie broke up the planned speech of Samuel Gould, a leading speaker for the American Anti-Slavery Society at a local church. The mob, which was put together very quickly by a short notice in the Poughkeepsie paper, pelted Gould with rocks and broke windows at the home where he was staying. In 1839, another lecturer assigned to the Mid-Hudson area by the American Anti-Slavery Society was mobbed and driven out of Newburgh. Next. Even free men weren't free. John Boulding escaped from slavery in South Carolina around 1840 and had been living in Poughkeepsie since then, working as a tailor. In 1851, a visitor from South Carolina recognized him and he was arrested. He was to be taken to New York City, but the people of Poughkeepsie swarmed the sheriff's office to prevent or try to prevent his departure. Nonetheless, he was taken to New York, tried, and then sent back to his owner in South Carolina.
How do I?
But, are we okay? Okay. But the citizens of Poughkeepsie raised the $2,000 for his release. Boulding returned to his family in Poughkeepsie to acclaim and went back to his work as a tailor. He's buried in Poughkeepsie at the Duchess Rural Cemetery. This came as part of the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law, and it put almost any Black person at risk. An agent could simply claim that the person was a runaway, and often with little evidence, the arrested person might be taken down south into slavery. Perhaps more than any other law in the antebellum period, the Fugitive Slave Law ignited the fire of abolition and helped fuel broad support for the Underground Railroad. An amazing story from Marlborough, titled in the Poughkeepsie Eagle from December 27th of 1860. The kidnapped sailor, a free Black man of Marlborough, New York, whose name is as yet unknown, but who was employed as a sailor on a ship operating between New York and southern ports, was abducted and sold into slavery around the year 1850. The man was transferring a trunk from one vessel to another, probably in New Orleans, when he was, quote, immediately seized and confined and eventually sold to a New Orleans trader, close quote. About 10 years after his capture, the man stowed away on a ship in New Orleans and arrived back in New York City, arrived in Poughkeepsie by train in late December 1860. He then crossed the frozen Hudson River on foot to seek out his father in Marlborough. Two others escaped with him on the ship from New Orleans. And the Eagle reported that they were, quote, already on their way to Canada via the Underground Railroad, close quote. This is important not only for the issue of how the free Blacks were at risk, but also this is the only direct contemporary reference to Underground Railroad activity that we have located in a Poughkeepsie newspaper, the only direct evidence. And lastly in this, as many of you know the story of Solomon Northrop. 12 years a slave was based on his experience. Northrop was born a free man, and while he was on a music tour in Washington, D.C., he was kidnapped and sent into slavery in Louisiana. Next. So let's take a look at the underground in our own area, which was operating, as I said, long before there was a railroad. Surprising as it may seem, many people do not know that New York had a large enslaved population. The county was sparsely populated after its founding in 1693, Dutchess County, I should say, as well as Ulster, but as new agriculture and markets developed, both white and Black populations grew. The enslaved population tripled between around 1720 and 1790. half of all New York State's enslaved people lived in the Hudson Valley. And the state had a larger concentration of enslaved people than any area north of Maryland. You'll recall I mentioned a few minutes ago a Shawangunk group of bounty hunters whose purpose was to capture freedom seekers. That was 1796, well before our traditional understanding of when the Underground Railroad was operating. In fact, men and women began working their way toward freedom from the very beginning of the institution. Notices were posted on church doors and in local newspapers, north and south, alerting citizens and readers to be on the lookout for these so-called runaways. They invariably warned everyone not to aid these runaways in their escape. Running away was the ultimate form of rebellion and the most expensive to the owner. The runaway's labor was lost for a period of time or perhaps forever. And that labor had ultimately to be repurchased, either by paying to have the runaway returned or buying the labor of a new enslaved person. These notices, collectively known as runaway slave ads, are a gold mine of source data on the enslaved and their conditions. This ad placed in 1806 from Wappinger, so let me read through it. Ran away on the 29th of July, 1802, a mulatto girl named Mary. The reason of her being now advertised is that I have heard of her being at the 9 Partners. Whoever will take up said girl and commit her to New York jail or restore her to the owner shall receive the sum of $40 and all reasonable expenses. All persons are hereby strictly forbade to harbor or employ either of the above runaways under the most severe penalty the law can inflict, and belong Wappings Creek, August 27th, 1806. There was a second ad that went along with this. That's why Anne mentions either one of the above. She posted the ad 4 years after Mary ran away because I have heard of her being at the 9 Partners. This in itself is a nice piece of suggestive corroboration of 9 Partners' involvement in the Underground Railroad, or what came to be known as the Underground Railroad. Long valued Mary's services highly. Even after all this time, she was willing to pay $40 for her return. Throughout the 1700s and early 1800s, newspapers contained many notices of men and women attempting to escape their enslavement. Local historians have found close to 1,000 of these ads, covering the area from northern New Jersey through the Hudson Valley. The most recent study, in a book titled In Defiance by Susan Stesson-Cohen and Ashley Herbert Biagini, identified 607 individual runaways who escaped in the Hudson Valley from 1735 to 1831. They were able to identify the county of escape for 585 of these. Ulster County accounted for 74 runaways, or a little over 12%. Dutchess County had the most, 135, or 23%. Albany and Westchester counties were about even, and 83 runaways came from Orange County. 81% of the runaways were men, and more than 60% of the runaways were young, between the ages of 10 and 30. The earliest ads show up in 1735. The freedom seekers here in New York, like countless others from the South, were attempting to emancipate themselves. They took a great leap of faith that they would find their way to freedom. Important to note that the point of view of these ads is always that of the owners. However, though they were enslaved, the freedom seekers here clearly had a strong sense of their own agency. After the 1830s, information about the Underground Railroad in the Mid-Hudson region becomes even more difficult to find. Fergus Bordewich, as we noted earlier, did a lot of research in this area. He doesn't believe it was because of a decrease in runaways. Rather, it was a result of changes to the river traffic. Robert Fulton's Claremont launched in 1807. And after that, says Bordewich, quote, the Hudson rapidly became the great interstate highway of its day, close quote. Travel time on the Hudson River between New York City and Albany was cut in half from 15 hours to 7. With luck, a fugitive could expect to leave New York and be in Canada within a week. In addition to the steamboats, cargo barges were being towed from New York to the Erie Canal, providing another vehicle for escape. During this period prior to the Civil War, there might have been as many as 500 ships a day traveling on the river. Remembering the experience we heard of Frederick Douglass and others, it would have been faster, safer, and more efficient for runaways to be stowed on board a fast-moving steamboat or even a barge. The overland routes were riskier, a trip that could take 10 days or more to get from New York to Albany. Now, this transportation revolution in the first half of the 19th century also included true railway expansion. With the completion of the New York and Erie Railroad line to Dunkirk on Lake Erie in the year 1851, and a further branch to Buffalo, the Erie Railroad became the first long-haul railroad in the country. There was a stop after going out of Philadelphia in Port Jervis, and it's possible freedom seekers would have traveled from there to Buffalo. At that point, it was a short steamboat ride to Canada. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about an important issue that comes up. And you may have some of these questions yourself or have heard from others. Was my house on the Underground Railroad? House, building, church. It's one of the most frequent questions about the Underground Railroad. It has to do with this identification as buildings, homes, etc., as so-called stations on the Underground Railroad. For many of you who have these questions or have heard such questions, let me tell you to start out, it's very, very difficult to make a firm determination. The first question we have to ask is, when was the house built? If it was built after the year 1862, then there is almost no chance that it was part of the Underground Railroad. From that first question, we go on to a series of other questions. And there's a detailed rating system that has been developed, commonly used in Underground Railroad research, called the Wellman Scale, developed by historian Judith Wellman. Through careful and thorough research, historians will end up at one of 5 degrees of likelihood that a particular site was engaged in the Underground Railroad. From starting out at level 1, which is the story is probably not true, down to level 5, which is the story is true or almost certainly true, with conclusive evidence of involvement. There is no level 6, which says we are 100% absolutely certain that this was a site on the Underground Railroad. And in fact, in testings of several hundred sites across New York State and in the state of Maryland, 65% of the sites have received a level 2, which is story probably true. Probably true. No reason to doubt, but little or no evidence so far. And then it goes on from there. Next slide. A lot of the important work and programming being done in New York State today is under the banner of the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State. The Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project is a member. You can visit their website to see it's about 36 sites and programs across New York and what they're doing, etc. Of course, as you probably know, no sites are active right now, and we're all waiting for COVID to go away so that our history tours and programming can begin again. So let me finish. From the arrival of the first Africans in the early 1600s, New York was a place of slavery, fear, and unrest. The spaces of danger that I mentioned deeply affected the lives of African Americans. Even after 1827, Blacks in New York were not entirely free, not least because the Hudson Valley, like the rest of the state, was in no way free from racism. Laws limiting Blacks' right to vote, to attend school, and more existed almost everywhere. And as we saw, free Blacks risked being kidnapped and sold into slavery. Sojourner's desire to be free was a constant throughout her life. As an enslaved woman and a free Black, she saw most of her brothers and sisters sold off to white families. This, wrote one historian, quote, created an open wound in her heart and became fuel in her later years to sustain her desire to be free, close quote. In addition, she recalled the harsh living conditions she experienced under her owners: dark cellars, limited light, straw mattresses, what Sojourner herself called the misery. Sojourner joined the ranks of the Runaways and freedom seekers. In 1827, the same year that slavery was to be officially abolished in New York State, she ran away from her current owner when he sold off one of her 5 children. She went into hiding with a sympathetic white neighbor, the Quaker family Van Wagenen in Ulster County. For Sojourner Truth, eventually the spaces of danger expanded to what Bard historian Myra Armstead calls, quote, a geography of slavery and freedom. This was crucial in how she saw the world. Isabella's identity, Armstead writes, was a function of geography. Early on, she lived her life enslaved in those spaces of danger. After gaining her freedom, she tried on a new identity, living in New York City as Isabella Van Wagenen. But she found that life confining as well, and so decided on an altogether new identity. One where she could move through space freely, able to believe, talk, work, speak as she thought. To remain in one place, to put down new roots, created disappointment and cognitive dissonance for her. Transient space, itinerant space, concludes Armstead, untrammeled and unfettered by permanent stationary obstacles, constituted an ideal geography of freedom for her. She would no longer be blocked because she would always be on the move. She would sojourn and thereby speak her faith on an unending journey. No longer underground, she found her freedom. Thank you very much. And if there's time, I will try to answer questions. If you want to get in touch with us at the History Project, you can go to our website, www.mhantislaveryhistory.org. There's an email where you can contact me. We send out a periodic newsletter. So get to me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. We appreciate you. A big virtual round of applause. If anyone has any questions, now is the time.
Yeah.
to throw them into the chat function, and we'll make sure to get those answered.
Okay.
I know that our assistant park manager, Jeff Litwinowitz, was with us for a moment, but I think he may have had to step away. He was going to tell us a little bit more about the Sojourner Truth statue that is coming to the Walkway.
Oh, it'd be wonderful.
Preparations for that have begun. Jeff, are you by chance still with us, or do you have to pop off? Yeah, I thought he had to go. Okay. We'll see if he might be able to get back on while we have, whoa. I don't know what that was. We did have a question coming in. All it says, Peter, is can you talk more about the History Project?
Yes, I can talk a little more about the History Project. The History Project began around 2006, 2007, and it drew out of an idea of a group of folks in around Dutchess County to sponsor the replica ship Amistad. Some of you will remember the Amistad ship that was taken over by enslaved people, and they were then arrested and tried, and their defender was John Quincy Adams. Anyway, there was a replica ship, Amistad, that was touring around the East Coast, and a group of folks said this would be a good idea and try to get to Poughkeepsie. They raised a few funds, and so they brought it there, and then out of that grew the idea that we should begin to do some research on the history of slavery and anti-slavery here in our own area. There had been a number of articles and stories written over the years. There's a number of great articles in the annual yearbooks of the Dutchess County Historical Society, where some initial research had been done. There have been some great work on the history of Quakers in this area. So they got together, did some more research, and let me just stop there. If you go on to the Anti-Slavery History website and go under Education and Research, there is a research document there of about 50 names in and around Dutchess County, and the research that we were able to do back then. You'll see a lot of notes that say more research needs to be done. We could learn more about this. There might be something more there. So after that, we developed 2 books. One is the History of Slavery, Anti-Slavery, and the Underground Railroad, a Dutchess County guidebook that's available for purchase. And that identifies a dozen or more sites in the county, as well as events and people involved in it as well. A few years after that, we published a book called 36 Anti-Slavery Songs, 36 out of the many, many hundreds that existed. That book helped form the basis of material for a group we sponsored called the Dutchess Anti-Slavery Singers. The singers wear period dress and have performed dozens of concerts around the area. So those are a couple of the major areas. And then lastly, we have given some workshops in addition to lectures like today. We've done a couple of workshops on understanding abolitionist history by using music. We did the National Council for History Education several years ago out at Niagara Falls. and elsewhere. So a lot of our work has been participating and involving ourselves with other groups. We are currently supporting the efforts of the African American Spirit, which is the former name of the Black History Project in Poughkeepsie. I think Dan has been attending the programs of the Spirit of Unity in Poughkeepsie, and we're also involved with the Dutchess County. So we look for alliances and sponsor speakers. One of our major programs has been a once yearly engagement under the auspices of the Wallace Center in Hyde Park. This past February, we hosted Andrew Del Banco, who was talking about his new book and the impact of the fugitive slave law. So there's a lot of different activities, and I would encourage all of you who have an interest in this history, get in touch, and there's things we can work on. As I mentioned, there's a lot of potentially fruitful areas for local research. So if you have an interest in local history, which I suspect most everybody on this call does, there's work to be done in Ulster County, in Orange County, in Dutchess County, up in Columbia, because this is very, very important, and for me, very, very exciting history.